Thank you so much for coming all, and also a very warm thank you to the ConsenSys Ethereal Lounge to hosting this event and graciously giving us the space tonight. And also thanks to 196 Strategies for helping so much with the logistics of putting on this event. We're here today because we want to talk about resilience and adaptation. And this is the other conversation that often is not happening when we talk about fragility in the world. So here in Davos, we've probably had a lot of conversations about sustainability and how to avert the course that the world is currently on, how to reduce emissions, how to turn around climate change, and so on. What we want to talk about today is the other side of that. And the question we have is, what if we don't change any more minds? What if climate change is going to happen? What if the political instabilities in our world are real and might even get worse? What if all the technology risks that we've been talking about are real? So we believe that in the next 10, 20 years, we might face major disruptions to our world. They can come from climate, from war, from technology, all over. And instead of just averting them, the resilience angle on this is, what can we do so that we're okay? So that no matter what happens, we are somehow going to get through it and we're somehow going to get out of it. And I'm really excited that we get to have this conversation in Davos here today. The way this works is that we're going to have each of the speakers introduce themselves very briefly and then give about 3 minutes of their own perspective on the topic, if you like. And then afterwards, we're going to jump right into an interactive discussion where I would also welcome contributions and questions from you in the audience. And since we have a small curated space with specific invitations, I would like to make this very interactive. And we're going to start over here.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Carl Ganter. I'm director of Circle of Blue and Vector Center. I'm a journalist, and I'm covering the things today that we're talking about. So if we can cue up our slides here. And I'm also a photographer, so I used to work for Time and National Geographic. So I actually do work in the today. So I'll take you very quickly on my itinerary to the front lines of what we're talking about, and we'll make it real as soon as we have the slides up. Or if we want to go another... Oh, here we go. Oh. Great. Okay, so we talked about a fragile planet. So we are on the blue planet. We are on the water planet. And Houston, we have a problem. This is the Mir spacecraft. Jerry Linenger and I co-presented a session here 10 years ago in the Congress Center. He talked about making water from sweat and urine in space in his little orbiting spacecraft. And here we are in our little thirsty blue planet, our own Earth. So yes, we have a water problem. It's the #1 crisis according to the Global Risk Report from the World Economic Forum. Actually, I mispronounced that. Crises. It's actually an E. It's multiple crises. So this is a big number. I'm not going to bore you with lots of numbers, but 700 million people could be displaced by 2030. These are real numbers from the World Bank. This is a possibility for migration. We're hearing about migration from in Syria, Middle East, potentially Bangladesh, India. So these are on the front lines. We've heard all about day 0 candidate cities. We heard about Cape Town, right? These are some of the other candidate cities on the radar. Again, I'm just putting this up on your radar. So back to Jerry's spacecraft. So he showed me this picture. Those are dust storms starting in Inner Mongolia, blowing to Beijing and all the way to Los Angeles. A little closed ecosystem that we're on here. But if he dropped a golf ball out of his spacecraft, here's where it would land. So I literally asked Jerry, where would it land? He said, no, this isn't how physics works. I went anyway. So this is Inner Mongolia. These are the big coal mines that are fueling China's industrial growth. Okay, this is where the coal comes from. This is where the dust storms are coming from, epicenter of climate change. But this is a story about people. It's a story about us. It's a story about our friends like Wu Yun, who's the daughter of an Inner Mongolian shepherd family that I met. So I've been back to visit now 4 times. The coal mines behind her, the coal processing facility, and their wells are going dry because the mines are pulling the groundwater to wash the coal and to cool the power plants. So this is mutual assured depletion. This is groundwater being pumped 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in Punjab because electricity is free. The farmers leave their pumps running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for flood irrigation. They don't even have switches on the pumps. So this is the other side of that. What happens when your groundwater goes away in places like north of Delhi here where they're planting rice? that water doesn't smell just like raw sewage, it smells like chemicals. So I literally went upstream to find out where it was coming from. So when your wells go dry, you turn to other resources and other water supplies. This is what that water supply looks like from a pulp paper mill. So they're irrigating with the runoff from pulp paper mills and tanneries now, and that's actually affecting their food systems. So they're just hoping the wastewater runs enough so they can leave. A lot of the farmers there in these kind of peri-urban areas. So what happens too in other parts? They're irrigating with raw sewage outside of Bangalore. And they're washing, the good news is they're washing the beets before they go to market, but that doesn't wash the inside of the beets. So these farmers don't even eat their own produce. They still ship it to Delhi and to Bangalore, but they don't eat their own produce. They source it upstream. So we're all here, we talk about data, we talk about the world being a click away. It's not, because sometimes we make assumptions about data sources, right? So this is the data source in Punjab at the irrigation district. I was very careful not to wake up the servers. Sorry, I'm trying a data joke. So what do we have to do to really shift this course? And I hope this is part of our conversation going forward here and beyond. We need to align our perception, our sentiment, what we believe with the reality, with the trusted data, and then actually put that with the real context. That's what we're working on. That's what we're doing with both on-the-ground photographers wading through raw sewage and marrying that with real big data. Because the Earth is the ultimate machine learner, and unfortunately it is learning badly right now. So hopefully we're going to set a new course. Right now we're launching an initiative called Designing Water's Future, which we did 10 years ago. And Chris Lubkman's in the back there. He was there from Arup. Hi, Chris. One of our resilient cities experts on the planet. So we're going to redesign water's future because we have people like Wu Yun on the front lines. As I mentioned, the last time I went back, the coal mines were getting closer. This is the view out of her front door, getting much closer. And this is the view in the grasslands, in the summer grasslands, where they now graze their sheep. Notice that's not grass that sheep graze on, and notice the sand soils behind her. So when we talk about these issues, they're happening now. We can either have a found generation or potentially a lost generation. These are young women that walk every day, several hours a day, to get water the border of India and Pakistan. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to align perception, reality, and the real story, and drive this issue forward with stories from the front lines.
I have a couple images, but I don't think you can load them yet. But you want to load them? Yeah. You want to go to one more person?
Yeah, I can quickly introduce myself before we move on. So my name is Julia Bossman. I've served on the Global Future Council at the World Economic Forum, specifically on artificial intelligence and robotics, and I'm the former president of Foresight Institute. I'm currently with Future Talks and with the Resilience Group, where we want to identify the right actions to take about this exact issue.
Hi. Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa Grellet. I'm an executive director at ConsenSys, where I lead some of our social impact work. I'm also the president of the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition. What I'm keen on discussing here is that there's a huge trust in technology that, you know, it can solve a lot of the issues. But as you've seen on the ground, deploying technology is hard. It takes time. So, and it takes also buy-in, as you've said, and a shared perception of reality and where the solution is. So I'm really keen on discussing today how public-private partnerships can help, you know, shape that vision for the future, and how technology can really help accelerate that.
Okay,
yeah, let's do it.
Hi. Thanks. My name is Megan Smith. I run a company together with Susan and others called Shift 7, which means and, if you type it. And I used to be the Chief Technology Officer for the United States, and I worked for President Obama for 3 years. I come from tech, from Google and MIT and smartphones and things like that. And the main focus for us is this idea of collective genius. And so we're a little member of all of us, like and. And so this idea of how can we unlock our systems and play like the whole orchestra, whether it's communication and design and storytelling or techie things, or, you know, like getting people to work together at the highest levels. So that's sort of this idea. And this image itself is from the moment when the Hokulea came home. And how many people have ever heard of Hokulea? So Hokulea is like a Polynesian sailing canoe, like the movie Moana, only it's true. And so they sailed around the planet. And the age of AI is so interesting to know that humans could sail around the planet with no instruments, including no compass. So maybe us and you on a canoe, middle of the Pacific, which way do we go? And they went around the world. It's amazing. And then when they came home, and they're doing high-end energy things all the way to community things and culture, and when you put it together, you can move really fast. Just a quick thing about one of the things we work on is how do we get everybody in? And so I just have a couple fast images of that. One is, this is men's lines to women's lines in 2,000 films. We have taught ourselves that men speak and women don't much. And by age, the men get more voice as they get older and women less. What could we do about it? We could talk about it. We can work on the art. We can also measure it in the films. That's Star Wars from long ago, Carrie Fisher, gender, race. Who gets to talk? White people and men. And then over time, in the new films, it's changing. Could we take this into the writer's room? Could we take this into the studio before we make the film and make sure they really meant to make this? So this is face recognition, natural language processing like Alexa and Siri, but for the movie makers and the filmmakers so that we could use these tools. The main point of this specific example, just one example, is that AI and machine learning and face recognition, all this stuff, is not just for self-driving cars and precision medicine and robots and all that. It's for anything. So every single SDG, especially SDG 5 and the Justice SDG, definitely should be using this. And we can work together with social scientists, artists, technical people, youth. The next one is just two quick images about youth. This is Grace. She's in 10th grade in New Orleans, and she's teaching the police chief how to code because there's lots of data for justice that everybody could use, and we could get out of this mess. So she's like a perfect example, and then we got lots of kids like her all over the United States to be in a community organizing and innovation people work together in all of these jurisdictions now talk every month and get their high schoolers and work on their data to fix all this challenge with racism and other problems in that. Last image of youth, these 4 kids were cast from the science fair into this film. And they're all over the world inventing stuff. This kid noticed all this stuff around her home in Bangalore, and this junk blew into her school bus, and she thought, I better start measuring all the water. And so now all the kids are super woke and trying to do danger maps all around. So in addition to the storytelling, the tech kids and adults can work together and do these kinds of things. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to go for. And so anything anyone wants to work with, I'd like to help you.
Hi, my name is Michael Mayernick. Is this on? Yeah. I'm the co-founder of a company called Spinnaker, which works in the AI space. I wear 2 hats. Running Spinnaker, we work largely providing AI-based intelligence and time series data systems. So that's often used in infrastructure, in aerospace, and telecom. And a lot of the things that we work on are the sorts of gains in efficiency you hear in conversations at places like Davos, where we're going to sort of drive down, efficiencies and squeeze every little drop out of all of our systems. And what's interesting is this type of intelligence often creates short-term efficiencies and enables us to deal with kind of day-to-day modularity very efficiently, but also introduces long-term risk in terms of reducing the system's redundancies and abilities to deal with really black swan major events. And so there's a tension that I see and I'm super interested in between increased efficiency, additional smart systems, and the way that that actually works in tension with these sort of long-term systemic risks and can even introduce those things. The second hat that I wear is I serve as the global chair of an international community called Sandbox, which is a network of 1,500 people, sort of change makers, experimenters. And at Sandbox, we often experiment with novel models of governance, radical democratic approaches to change making and problem solving, almost anarchic systems of self-organizing around tackling certain challenges. And I'm especially interested in what it means to use communities and networks of people using novel systems of governance to solve and tackle challenges. And I often wonder if these sort of self-organizing systems can tackle long-term challenges as well as short-term. And I'm not sure if the answer is yes. I certainly hope it can be, though.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I'm keen not to talk too much after some of those graphics, which I think were excellent. I appreciated that. So I'd like to just correct a little bit, or not correct, but add to your opening statement. We will address some of the major issues around climate change, and we will have to learn to live with some of the serious impacts. So we have gone beyond the point now where we can avoid any impacts, and it's a question of degree. But at a moment where we're losing 4,000 tons of sea ice, who wants to take a guess at the unit of time in which we're losing 4,000 tons of sea ice. Every minute, right, which really brings it alive. So I wear various hats. I was the head of political strategy at the UN Climate Convention when we got the Paris Agreement. And we made a very deliberate decision on the floor of the UN to trade political expediency for environmental sufficiency. We knew it wasn't enough, but we also knew the risk of failure was so great that we had to make that deal and we'd do it again. Now, since then, we have now a very limited window of time to make up that gap before we start going into a 2-degree plus world, and we begin to get a clearer picture of what that really means. So I do multiple things to try and address that with my business partner, a woman called Christiana Figueres. One of those is with the Global Commission on Adaptation. So that's 9 heads of state who've come together to try and think about how do we get our arms around this adaptation issue, this resilience issue, and how do we plow more capital into actually developing and financing projects to make infrastructure in particular more resilient. Infrastructure is fascinating. The next 15 years happen to be a cyclical moment at which much of the infrastructure of the world is going to be either rebuilt or built for the first time, depending on where you are in the world. If we can't build that infrastructure in a manner that is both sustainable and resilient, it will be locked in for the complete duration of that economic cycle, and we'll have lost this historical opportunity to do something about it. And there are various structural barriers to doing that, which we can get into if that's interesting.
Awesome. Very much appreciate that. Thank you. I want to follow up with a question to you, Tom, by the way. So you said in your opening remark that we are past the point of return and we will see some very real consequences. Can you explain more what specifically you think we will be experiencing in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, so I don't know if you saw the IPCC report that came out on 1.5 degrees. So the Paris Agreement has below 2 degrees with best efforts to reach 1.5 enshrined into it. And the IPCC at that point were asked to go away and look at what the difference would mean in terms of impact between 1.5 degrees and 2. And we thought, you know, simplistically, it would be a quarter worse. It turns out it's an order of magnitude worse in terms of hundreds of millions of people displaced, hundreds of millions of additional refugees, major areas of cropland yielded or rendered unusable as a result of that. So the answer to your question is it all depends, but it all depends on the reaction in a very, very small window, right? What they said is we have 12 years to fundamentally turn this around by peaking emissions in the next 2 to 3 years and then being on a long downward trajectory. So we still have an opportunity to influence what you asked, but it's getting pretty small.
And I'd like to take what you said and bring it back to us, because when we hear about climate refugees and things happening in other places of the world, we sometimes may think, oh, but our standard of living is just going to stay the same. And I believe that's not going to be the case, because for one, climate refugees have to go somewhere, which will lead to global tensions about where are they going to relocate. Countries can become more isolationist. And taking that together with all the technological developments we have going on right now that also make our world more fragile, I think we will have to face a reality where we may not rely on our global supply chains anymore. And I heard a sound. I have a question over there, but I heard that you would say something.
I just had a cool data point. Do you know Bill Gross from Idea Lab? I was just looking up his slide, and just for our mind's perspective, he said that we add basically the equivalent of 3 Hiroshima bombs to the ocean in heat every second. Wow. So that's the way to think about this.
3 Hiroshima bombs per second.
3 Hiroshima bombs a second, adding that heat to our oceans. And by the way, I'm wearing the SDG Ocean Summit that my friend Susan gave me. The Hokulea team said that of every 4 breaths we take, 3 are from the ocean.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question for you, Michael, because you're the global chair of Sandbox, so you're very tuned into the global conversations that are going on, especially with the millennial generation. And do you see a tension between the conversations that are going on about we should just convince world leaders to reduce emissions, or we should convince corporations to reduce emissions, versus we are past the point of return, what are we going to do, how are we going to adapt, and even despair on the far end of the spectrum? What do you think about that? Yeah,
I mean, despair is an interesting way to look at it. I think there's enormous potential in people organizing together and trying to find solutions, but there is a danger to it as well. Often, a lot of the efforts that are sort of thrown around for the younger generation to take action and to feel like they're participating in the solution only sort of sate the feeling of guilt or the need to take action that people feel without ever really making meaningful progress against the core challenges and goals. So one thing I like to ask is every time a sort of challenge is put out there to the youth of the world is, does that challenge correspond to an explanation of how much progress that makes against the long-term goals? And often, shockingly, the answer is no. I think that's very troubling because it means people are called to action and feel like they're contributing, but may not actually meaningfully move the needle on the underlying problem. So that brings us back to the real question, which is, can these kinds of acts of mobilization and involvement end up really moving the needle and making meaningful change, or do we need to create new avenues of feedback loops or even new types of power and mandate in managing these sort of long-term risks or global challenges? And I don't know that the answer to that is resolved yet. Maybe it's a hybrid, maybe there's opportunities for this, but I do think we need to start changing our thinking from, yes, we can all do this together, to what would it mean to build really strong, powerful structures that have the mandate to consider these long-term challenges and almost do that kind of thinking for us.
Yeah, good point to move from the feel-good activism to getting real with ourselves. I saw a point over there.
Yeah, can I just challenge that?
Please.
Okay, so so my experience of seeing inside the UN is that those systems are remarkably permeable to external movements, much more so than I expected them to be. And I think we've made a mistake in the climate space, which I come from, in saying everything is your responsibility. If you care about climate change, you shouldn't fly, shouldn't eat meat, etc. Of course you should do those things, but also it's about influencing political structures that you would engage with. I mean, I think if you look at this last year, the student movement that started in Sweden with Greta Thunberg and now all these kids around the world doing strikes, it's having a real impact. Now, is it having an impact on emissions? Probably not. But is it changing the political context and the narrative, just like the Parkland kids did with guns? I think it's really powerful.
Can I add to that? So Susan Myers and Susan Ellison are here. We, with the United Nations Foundation, our group and others, we do a thing called a Solution Summit. And so this idea of RPM versus MPH or KPH, how do we we continue to share like and that and pressure, but also like we got a lot of people, they have already invented a lot of things, but no one knows. So one of the things we could use the communications networks better for is finding the doers who've already fixed things and accelerating them. Because if you're a Bezos or Zuckerberg, there's ecosystems for you. But if you're from a different place, there's often not. So as an example, we worked with MIT this year, and we did the MIT Solve from the Oshete-Shakone Standing Rock Pine Ridge entrepreneurs. And so now we have 22 applications of not my idea, but I'm building this kick-ass solar furnace that goes on your house and saves you a third of your bill. My name is Henry Redcloud. I'm a tribal elder, and I've been doing this for 25 years, and no one ever funds me, but I got 3,000 of them so far. So how about we come up underneath him? Or Rose, who does medicine root garden, she's got a hoop house with like the most incredible tomatoes you ever saw, no money, total food desert. She's training 22 families, doing a farmer's market, a this, a that. And we're like, okay, let's get a little bit of money to you, and you're that. I instigated the Malala Fund with Malala because Malala will be the best Bezos-type entrepreneur to lead us to girls' education. So what we do is we put out a web page that Susan did at the UN. We say, who already fixed these SDGs? What do you got? And we get 1,000 submissions from 134 countries in 2 weeks every year. We're going to go to our 5th year. You can't imagine the things that people of the 7 billion of us are already doing. So one thing we could do is use the will and get more of us to know who is already doing what and how do I help you? Right, like the kids I just showed you. Like those little girls up here with the hard hats, they have hard hats because they're off the beach in Indonesia where they're digging tin for our cell phones and dumping crap in the water, and the girls are inventing new filters. So what's great is we get the kids from Sweden, the kids in the protest, and don't just strike, invent, both.
And that comes back to the insufficiency of our financing models to actually identify and elevate those solutions, and I think that's definitely improving.
Because we've got plenty of money, we can do it.
Yeah.
Amazing. That's exactly the kind of hands-on approaches that we need to face these crises. I want to bring in Vanessa. So you are working on blockchain and decentralization, and I would like to hear your perspective on how do you think about a centralized world, whether a decentralized world, and how we can move towards more resilient communities, especially in the face of maybe facing global disruption in some places in the world?
Yeah, I think the centralized world we live in allowed very efficient processes, but also allowed the top 1% to capture all the efficiencies. And so I think the principles of decentralization is us trying to trickle that back to the people. And we do that with self-empowerment. That's the first step to decentralization. And we see with this technology the opportunity to create self-sustaining communities. So whether it's with electricity, communities that can live off the grid, that can resist hurricanes or other climate-related catastrophes. We can create self-sustaining communities in terms of governance. I think we'll see huge movements. As you've said, we need to convince the existing structures, but we should create new structures to make decisions because, whether it's at the grassroots or it's top level, it's not efficient. It doesn't mean that they're going to change, but we need other ways of communicating, and blockchain-based decision-making and communities can do that. So as we've seen, for example, in France, we have the Gilets jaunes who are totally grassroots, outside of any institution, and it's very hard to grasp what they want because they don't have representatives, they don't have official representatives. And we're going to see these types of movements continue as countries get disrupted and people fail to meet minimal levels of livelihood. And so, for example, there's a project to federate voting on the blockchain in France so that people can have something that's not an official vote, but really a deep opinion pool which is recorded and safe and resilient. So I think the technology is not going to solve all our problems. Decentralized technologies, I think, however, are the way to move forward a little bit with what you do in terms of really grassroots movements, but also bringing that certainty of who does what, transparency, and additional things we can act upon.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. And I have a question for Carl over here. So you've traveled around the world taking these amazing photographs of the communities that are impacted. And I just wonder if you could share with us what you've seen there in terms of fragility and resilience. So when you look at a community, there's certain services and goods that they need, like food, nutrition, energy, water, and so on. Where do you see fragilities that we may not be aware of, and how do you think those are addressed?
Sure. There are a couple really simple things. I mean, when we fix water, we fix a lot of things. I think, first off, some of the really exciting transitions we're seeing and the narrative storytelling is the intersections between the things that are visceral to us, and that's water and food. I think we're going to see a lot more look at the Lancet report just recently. But back to the kind of some of the simple fixes. For example, many of the hospitals in Africa do not have running water or sanitation. So here's a place where people are coming to get fixed, to get health, and they're getting sick. And so there are really simple fixes there to bring safe water to those areas. But then back to the meta message. How do we not just decide to fix 10 hospitals in a community somewhere in Africa? How do we fix 1 million? How do we fix all of them? How do we create that narrative story that's a meta story and that actually is a micro story? Because a lot of these issues, they are a global issue, our planet, but they also have really micro pieces. If we miss those micro pieces of the story, we miss the context and we miss the relationship. So I think for accelerating, we need to align the perception, what people believe, to the actual reality.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I would like to open it up to the audience now and invite contributions and questions to all of the panelists. Would anyone like to kick us off with a question over here?
Yeah. What are anybody's thoughts on who's using AI to better understand the everyday households so that these SDGs can really become activated in our culture and not just talked about at places like Davos?
What? I have thought related to that, and that's sort of like the challenges of using AI to deal with those types of problems. So, to analogize to the stock market, when we had the financial crisis, a lot of people said, well, we could have never seen this coming. This was a once-in-a-thousand-year event, which is quite a striking thing to hear, given that there's maybe 100 years of stock market data. So how is anyone making such a claim? Well, when you think about AI, a lot of the data systems that we're using to train AI on are very short-lived in the perspective of long-term systematic risk, of fragility. And so what does it mean to include in your training of these intelligence systems both that type of long-term resilience, which doesn't even show up in the data sets, much like the sort of stock market analogy, and also include these values that might be like evangelizing or discussing SDGs, other challenges. And I think what we have to recognize when we think about what does it mean not just to fix the immediate problems, but what does it mean to get better at solving these types of problems generally, recognizing we're entering a world of additional complexity, increasing fragility, increasing challenges on our ecosystems and our larger landscapes. And I think there's going to be a real challenge around how we use AI and how we incorporate long-term challenges that don't show up in any of the training data. And we may just need new structures and new technological approaches, hybrid approaches, to incorporate that exact type of narrative and issues and challenges into the day-to-day interactions we have with AI.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on this because the data that is used in AI is not a clean data. And there's work done at MIT with the Artificial Justice League where you see embedded in the data that people use are internal biases, racial biases, economic biases. So it's something that we're going to need to overcome in the coming years, and that's why I was stating at the beginning, over-reliance on technology and the hope that we all put into technology needs to be tamed a little bit.
There's an interesting thing. When I went to government, none of the tech people had meant to go to government. President Obama asked us to come, add a chair, because they're very talented colleagues not using enough stuff. They know their stuff. We know this little bit together. So what I found was the tech people dominate in the tech world, and way down here is the policy and comms people. And when you go to government, policy and comms dominate, and the tech people aren't even invited. Of course, they're invited to like the Department of Energy or NASA or whatever, but they're not invited to the core meetings. And so we find that the answer to your question is it depends on what subject. In the case of like an Alexa or Siri or self-driving cars, there's extraordinary data sets and household data sets that are near real time, capturing some of it quite dangerous and being weaponized by different people. We have a lot of work to do there, and it's got bias. And then way over here on the SDGs, there's not data scientists at scale in the data science. Even in our data for SDGs, we have not enough data scientists. So if we have them, so it's a who with what. How do we get more people? And the way to diversify the data sets and tech in general is to techify everything else. Not as if tech is like some kind of arrogant, oh, let me explain you on tech, but as a colleague, because tech people can be quite arrogant. As I know from working in Silicon Valley. And they're also intellectual combat. Like, my idea is better than you, bam. And so there's a lot of like code review. It's why it's so sexist and programmer there with this youth, this young fraternity idea. So anyway, but getting together, like we've been talking about the stories that you're telling and the tech stuff that the youth and others. So it's in this mix. It's massively urgent, to your point.
Yeah. And we have a voice on the side over here.
Hi, I'm Chris Lubkomin from Arup. We design cities, and to me, head of Foresight Research and Innovation. So one of the interesting things for me is really about behavioral patterns. And how do we understand behavioral patterns, not just of individual households, but of people who live and dwell in cities where they don't really have houses. So for the very first time, we now can begin to track and trace urban patterns. And AI is really wonderful at pattern recognition. It's getting better. So we're starting to see this. We now know, because we're all tracked and traced in this country and most other big countries. So the Swiss government knows we're all here. They might not necessarily know why each of us is in this building, but they know we're here. And so what we're trying to work on now is getting to that point of understanding of the why. It's the same thing with water, with energy, and increasing the granularity of clean data sets, as one of you said, because the data sets are not yet really great. So that would be something which would be really useful in a global standpoint, not just from the global north, but in the entire world, getting better data sets so one can actually mine them and to create the understanding so that we can design that. And the other thing to say is, the lock-in, what we're seeing right now, is horrendous. And this is, to me, the greatest plea, is trying to help our clients and constituents understand that when they lock in infrastructure now, we're locking in those curves moving in the same direction for another 20, 30 years. And if you want to know what that looks like, just draw your own curve. And this is like the greatest urgency that I see for us, is to get that not locked in. So we're not doing that. So just to encourage.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And when we bring that down to individual behavior, we also need to address that we ourselves might all be locked in this paradigm that we've been living in the past decades. And when we think about disruptions we might face in the future, we might even have to adopt new ways of interacting with the world, or new ways we understand our own lifestyles. And that is going to also bring in behavioral economics and psychology to really drive this change. We want to wrap up fairly soon because we have another event in here. So first of all, I think I learned a lot here, and I'm really thanking all of you to participating in this. And I would like to end with calls to action. So if you could have one tweet-sized thing that, if you could ask everyone to do this, or people to consider, what would it be?
I guess I'll start. All right, point 5 is listen better, be better listeners and better course correctors. And point 1 is be active in policy. Everybody here has a platform. Everybody here has an influence, a following. Don't just tweet it, do it.
Maybe, Churchill said, the further back you can look, the further forward you'll see. And so sometimes in history, we've disappeared things, like people like Jane Addams, who used lots of data. Many people never heard of her, but she invented social work and got the Nobel Prize for it, and she used lots of data. So history rhymes. And so maybe I'd bring Mary Shelley in the room, because it's the 200-year anniversary of Frankenstein. And she was with Lord Byron, who's the father of Ada Lovelace, who invented artificial intelligence and computer science, and wrote at the same time as Darwin, wrote about the past of us, wrote about the future of us. So maybe thinking about Frankenstein and what Mary's nightmare is the monster never gets raised by us, and we're not friendly to him. And so the AI needs to be something that's with us, like Ada wrote, I wish to bequeath to the generations a calculus of the nervous system. And she was so famous that Dickens was at her bedside when she died, and you never heard of her. But she's the inventor of this, and she wanted it to be used with humanity as good colleagues. And it's interesting that Shelley was in her presence. So think about Frankenstein and what you would do with the algorithms, and how you don't black box all hail the algorithm.
So, not to repeat what has been said, I would focus on education. Educating yourself and educating others will be the key to unlock this shared vision, because you can't, argue some facts, although some like to do that. I think educating, everyone whether they're technique people or not, is really key, because then it's going to drive actual actions.
I think for me, what that means is when we demand change, when we work together, when we create movements, to be more precise about what we're asking for, and in particular, focus on what it means to create structural change that enables us to deal with problems of fragility better as a global system, rather than solving the particulars of any one individual problem. Because I think, as I mentioned before, we're going to face these challenges increasingly going forward. And the answer can't always be everyone individually takes the action that they need to solve all of these problems all the time. We need to get better at a systems level of solving these things. And I think if there's room for political activism, engagement, calls for change, it should be directed more at that level than the particulars of any one individual problem.
One of the most hopeful trends I see, I've worked in climate change for a long time, and climate is sort of an insular community, like many of the communities at Davos are a bit insular. But more and more over the last years, I've been going into other communities and finding people asking the question of how can they get involved in this. So I think that I would say that there was a wonderful quote from a US governor, and I forget who it was, that we are the first generation to understand the seriousness of climate change and the last to be able to do anything about it. And I would say we have now a 10 to 12 year window to turn this around. So whatever sector people are working in, whatever focus they have, just take 10 years of your career to say, I'm going to take the sector that I'm in, the work that I'm in, and figure out how this can contribute at this moment, because we're not going to get this chance again.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So I'm going to summarize everyone. We have a 10 to 12 year window, and we are the last generation to do something about this. So take this seriously and take time out of your career to be active. Don't just think about individual actions, but think about it on a systemic level and how to drive change in the systems level. Focus on education so that people engage with facts the real way and are educated about this. Think about what you would do with the algorithm, and don't just tweet, but act on this. Thank you so much.